We're delighted to have Yochai here. You know, as most people probably know, Yochai's a professor at Yale Law School and has really been among a handful of thought leaders in the area of internet law and policy that have been sort of doing not only foundational theoretical work on the structure of these new kinds of emergent networks, but have also been engaged in policy building and I guess even activism. Would you call it activism in this space? And you know, as a social scientist, I feel like work like Yochai's often puts much of social science to shame because of the scope at which Yochai's able to master not only the technical intricacies of the sorts of areas that he's looking at, but also, and the legal and policy dimensions, as well as, you know, the domains of political science and social science, economics. In particular, I would really encourage everybody who hasn't done so already to take a good look at Yochai's book, which is coming out March 23rd, called, the title, same as the title of his talk, The Wealth of Networks, which is really a synthesis of many, many years of work and analysis in the area of new networks, policy, law, economics, that does not only, it not only frames a new political economy for how to look at these emerging social, political, and economic structures, but also provides a roadmap for the kinds of interventions and contestations that we need to be aware of in the coming years. So we're delighted to have Yochai here, and I think you'll all agree that his work is sort of provides a really important lens into a lot of the issues we've been exploring in the Network Publics group.
Well, thanks, and thanks for inviting me. I always have great fun when I come here, which I have in the past couple of years. Always very interesting conversation. As Mimi said, in a very polite way, talking about my dilettantism, this has got lots of things in it. And what I'm going to try to do in about an hour is give you a very condensed form of the whole of the argument, and obviously because of the nature of its condensed nature, a lot will be left out, and hopefully in conversation we can work out some more. So I want to start with an image. It's a somewhat exaggerated but nonetheless accurate image of the increase in the costs of starting what is understood at the time as a daily circulation newspaper between 1835 and 1850. Right? In 1835, when the Herald was launched as the first mass circulation, or as it was understood, it cost roughly the equivalent of $10,000. 15 years later, doing roughly the same thing was $2.5 million. Now, the difference between 10,000 and 2.5 is that 10,000, we can imagine all sorts of ways in which it could be done and organized. And 2.5 million needs a business model. Now, that business model might be nonprofit, might be traditional foundation-based, might be government tax and funding, but it needs a business model. And that's a critical change that then gets carried over throughout the period we normally think of as the emergence of the information economy and the 20th century mass media culture, centered around this fact that as crowds grew, as the relevant audience, relevant in terms of polity, relevant in terms of culture, relative in terms of density of economic connections grew, the capital cost of being able to communicate effectively to this entire group increased. And so the ability to collect the capital, the physical capital necessary, became the organizing principle around which much of information production and exchange got organized. What we got was a stark bifurcation between producers and consumers, passive large audience, professional commercials, producers. These were not only market-based, these were also government-owned. That's the bifurcation we get in general between market and government in the dichotomy between socialist economies and capitalist economies, around this fact that no one can get around the money you need for the physical stuff. and it characterizes and anchors communications for the last 150 years. What we see in the networked information economy, that is the critical fact or intervention point, that then it's not by itself doing everything, but it's the critical destabilizing fact that then feeds into the economic structures, the social structures, some of the things that I'll talk about, many of the things that I'll leave out, is that we have radical decentralization of the capitalization of information production and exchange. Computation, storage, and communication, not necessarily that the total capital intensity of these has declined, but the distribution of capital has changed, so that this is very much like a router in the network and like a server that transmits to millions of people, in a way that a phone and a switch are not, in a way that a television and a broadcaster and a broadcast station are not. And basically we're in a position where every connected person, somewhere between 600 and 1 billion people on the planet, depending on how you count, has the physical capital necessary to make, communicate information, knowledge, and culture. Now, here's an interesting fact, therefore, about the network information economy. The most important inputs into the core economic activities of the most advanced economies are widely distributed in the population. This is not a condition we're used to be in. And this relates both to communication and computation resources and to human creativity, intuition, experience, and motivation, which are themselves non-fungible, individual, and unique. And any one of you who's left one job and moved to another and tried to leave someone a memo with all your knowledge so that they could step into your shoes knows what I'm talking about. You can't embody those and transfer them. They're unique. So, an image to describe this. In June 2002, a terrible thing happened in the United States. For the first time, a Japanese supercomputer outperformed the IBM supercomputers. There it was, the NEC Earth Simulator, shaming on American supercomputers. And then a sigh of relief, 2 years later, IBM Gene Blue just edges ahead. Except for one small fact throughout this period. SETI at home, 4.5 million connected computers with leftover computer cycles, calculating problems thrown at them when they're not being used from the SETI program in NASA, is running at much greater speeds. Now, this is a little outdated. Gene Blue now has 2 versions that are ahead of this, but this is better for graphical purposes, because who wants to show something that's just in the middle? Now, what happens when we have the most important information inputs so radically distributed? Behaviors that were once on the periphery of economic life, social motivations, cooperation, friendships, decency, move from the peripheries, from the household, from relations of friendship, from all sorts of exotic places that anthropologists go and study, to the very core of economic life in the most technically and economically advanced societies. This ends up undergirding 2 basic forms of production, or 2 newly important forms of production. One is commons-based production, which is production based on utilizing resource inputs from a resource set that no one owns, and appropriating the outputs without asserting exclusive rights on them. Now, this can be individual or collective. It can be commercial or non-commercial. We'll talk a little bit about how each of these works out. But the basic critical defining characteristic is that the inputs are taken from a common pool, and the outputs are appropriated, if they're appropriated at all, through some mechanism other than exclusion from them, so that they themselves then become available for others to reutilize in the same way. The other subset of commons-based production that has a now new efficacy that was not there before, and a certain kind of robustness, is peer production and sharing on large scale. Peer production is variously sized collections of individuals who effectively produce information goods, and what's critical, do it without price signals or managerial commands. So free and open source software, Wikipedia, things that ought not be there based on our traditional ideas of what happens if you get 50,000 people together and tell them, co-author in an encyclopedia with almost no technical constraints? The answer is not. You get something that nature then finds is roughly equivalent to Britannica. That's not your prediction 5 years ago, but it is the most recent actual study. The second thing that we're seeing is sharing of material resources. And I separate those out because in many ways that we care about, these are the same phenomenon. That is to say, many people pool small quantities of resources together to create an important alternative to both the market-based and the government-based systems. The economics are different because the economics of information are different than the economics of hard drives or CPUs or wireless, and so I separate them out. But the basic idea is large-scale practices of effective productive sharing. The components are material resources rather than human creativity, including private economic goods, and the outputs, like bandwidth, like computation, in the case of SETI at home, can be not necessarily public goods either. So a few examples. I mean, this is another fact, right? If in 1995 someone told you there are two groups of people who've seen the web browser and decided that a web server is something that's really critical and will be important. One of those groups is Microsoft, and they understand this to be central strategic goal. The other is a bunch of programmers who sort of thought they needed one and patched something together. And you'd say 10 years later, one of those groups would have 20% and the other 70%, and almost nobody else in the market. And you'd say, wow, that motley crowd succeeded in maintaining 20%. That would be very impressive. Of course, the motley crowd is the 70%. That's Apache. Microsoft is at the 20%. This is on web service software, which is the software that when you go to Amazon, does your secure transaction on their side, including Amazon in particular, for example, using Apache. I don't want to say anything more about software. I only want to say a few words about how this functions and open the conversation later. So here's an example that I've been giving for a while, and it's still good to just capture. NASA did a study of, well, a small number of people at NASA decided they would play with the study as the more accurate representation. What happens if you take the images as they come in raw from Mars, you put them up on a web interface, and you invite people to click and so generate maps that map where the craters are. Instead of using the 3 or 4 fully trained geologists doing the work as they normally do. What they found after 6 months was about 85,000 people contributed. It took them about 5 minutes or so to do each one of these little things. Then when they took 10, 12 people who did one of these and computed a consensus estimate, they got results that were, quote from the study, practically indistinguishable from those of a fully trained PhD. And they were marking and mapping the craters at a faster rate than they were getting them, the images live. So here you take a problem, and this is the critical point I want to make here and nothing else. You take a problem that requires the application of money in a traditional model, government funding into a program with fully trained professional people. You reorganize the task to pool the judgment and efforts of many people. You give them a task that in some sense is meaningful to them, and you replace the same output. This is the point about effective production through modularization in small-grained contributions using non-market motivations. That's fairly simple. What about encyclopedias? Well, if you go to Microsoft's Encarta, well, this is Barbie. So this is what you get for Barbie as the definition. If you go to Wikipedia, you get a slightly longer definition with going more deeply into the political questions on both sides and what the arguments are for our Barbie and against Barbie. There's actually an additionally back channel for talking about what does and doesn't make sense. It's a very different form of encyclopedia. But as I said, the fact that I was able to insert, after the last proofs, the first study that Nature actually did of Wikipedia, comparing it not to Encarta. I've been very timid about comparing it to Britannica because I didn't want to see what would be the result of the test it would ruin, except that the test turned out not to ruin the claims at all. They're equally bad, which is an enormous compliment to Wikipedia, I think. And of course, the Columbia Encyclopedia has Barbie Klaus. Now, what do we do with relevance, right? We always talk about there's so much stuff out there. what do we do with relevance? So if you remember, Yahoo's first innovation was get human beings to look at sites and decide what are good. So this is what Yahoo has for law journals. The Open Directory Project, about 60,000 volunteers, people who care about a particular category participate, and they update the listings. At this point, this has become a much more significant human-edited directory. So what do we have? We have relevance and filtering for relevance and quality done by human beings, but again, reorganized in a form that is effective and largely distributed. And when you think about it, Google is also a peer-produced outsources. It's an interface between a market actor that outsources its single most critical function, which is deciding relevance, to the collective judgments of web providers around the web through a mechanized system for polling those views. But the critical insight is people who are engaged enough with the web to have created their own website. And when you compare that to the, quote, market system, this is Overture, where the idea was you would pay, you, the person who wants to be found, would pay Overture. And the more you paid, the more likely it was that you would be found. So we know between Google and Overture who had the better model. So now that's about human judgment in the creation of content, in the creation of relevance and accreditation. Few words about stuff. So imagine that 6 or 7 years ago I came to you and I said, you know what, I want a data storage and retrieval system. I want it to store terabytes of data. I want it to be available 24/7 from anywhere in the world. I want it to be able to support 100 million users at any moment. I want it to be robust to attack, including closure of the main server index, injection of malicious files, armed seizure of major nodes. What will it take to do it? And the answer would be, I don't know, a decade, a couple of $1 billion bucks, we'll see. But of course, this is P2P file sharing, right? This is, you ignore for the moment the cultural meaning of the data, what's in there. You just look at the economics of what has been created. A radically robust, worldwide accessible, distributed storage system that's available from around the world and has survived all sorts of ups and downs. The data is still there, it's still available. Now, the motivation here is obviously quite easy for people to understand, if not for everyone to approve of. But we see this is the same phenomenon as distributed computing, right? People have lots of excess capacity. And we can go in questions, not now, I won't talk about it now, why we have all this excess capacity. Lots of excess capacity in small dollops. And they pool it together through social systems rather than through payment systems. And when you look at distributed computing, for example, there are only a couple of projects that pay people. And they're a lot smaller than the ones that actually tell people, come contribute your cycles to fight AIDS at home, or folding at home, or SETI at home. That's what gets people to contribute. Mesh networks, wireless networks, I've been waving this flag for 7 or 8 years now. Slightly less quixotically, I think, than before. But again, what do you see? You see the possibility and the early emergence of wireless networks based on people sharing their excess capacity and their bandwidth because they don't need it all the time. And that's the model. So now we've got phone trying to do this. That's an interface between market mechanisms and non-market mechanisms. We've had models throughout. We have some companies that are beginning to build it more at the municipal level. But it's the same economics. And then we have mix and match. Right, what's Skype? Skype takes the excess storage, the excess computation, and the excess bandwidth of any given computer and uses a Kazaa architecture to create a voice over IP network with no dedicated infrastructure except that the interfaces to the public switch network. Everything up to the point where you connect to the public switch network is peer-to-peer based on sharing of these 3 core components of the physical environment. So what are we seeing both in information, knowledge, and culture and in material goods? We could imagine a grid that looks at whether transactional frameworks are market-based or non-market-based and whether they're decentralized or centralized. Market-based systems, we have the price system and we have firms as the 2 market-based systems that are decentralized and centralized. And we have a good bit of experience with non-market-based centralized systems, be they government or traditional nonprofit. What we have now is essentially the emergence of a decentralized non-market system of social sharing and exchange, which again, was it there always? Of course it was there always. Here, could you take this box to my brother when you're going on your way? That's a form of social exchange. Excuse me, what's the way to Carnegie Hall? That's a form of social exchange, tourists, right? We've done it all the time. It just was more peripheral and didn't quite directly intersect with the market in information, knowledge, and culture as it is now. What are the characteristics? Decentralized authority and capacity to contribute to effective action. Instead of the property may I create, I just do it. Reliance on social information flows, social organizational approaches, and social motivation structures to know what are interesting problems, who's available and good for this particular thing. Money isn't always the best motivator, though it is still a motivator, right? The opposition as though there's just market-based systems or just social systems. It's not just. But suddenly we have enormous room for other things as well, which requires us to begin to understand the relationship between these two. Because adding money doesn't always improve the incentive. If you come to dinner and you leave a $50 check at the end, you don't increase the probability of being invited again. Now, this has created new sources of competition and new opportunities on the business side, on the economic side. The easiest things we all know about, P2P challenging the recording industry, free and open source software challenging Microsoft, Wikipedia challenging Grolier and Encarta. I suspect it'll be a while, if ever, before Britannica's accreditation function is really challenging this form. Skype competing with telecoms. But we also see new opportunities. So some of the things that we can characterize. We see well-behaved appliances like TVs and CD players shifting over into markets for production tools like PCs, handhelds, wireless. Strict bifurcation between consumer and infrastructure goods, shifting over to dual-use machines and soft infrastructure like Wi-Fi and Skype. How much eventually, if you get a decent framework for sharing Wi-Fi, is the value of having a machine, the ability to share others when you're, nomadic, as opposed to the connection locally. And this is where most of the rest of the talk will be, finished information and cultural goods to platforms for self-expression and collaboration, like GarageBand, like Craigslist, like Technorati. This is where, if you are into looking at this, this is where a lot of Web 2.0 type stuff, which you may think of as hype, and Bubble 2.0, or you may think of as really insightful, but a lot of what's happening in that regard is happening over here. One last point is you see a whole class of surfers which create a really mind-bending fact. So once upon a time, we used to think of things as deterministic and based on property and contract, right? There was suppliers, there was property and contract to the firm, which then was able, using that property, to contract with a customer. Now we have this weird thing. We have this belief. Stuff will flow out of connected human beings. We will use it as inputs, and we will contract and promise our clients that we will service it. Not only that, we're going to contribute stuff into these connected human minds, and we're going to build platforms, and we might actually pay some people to participate, and all of this on this probabilistic belief that stuff we need will come out and we can promise. It sounds crazy until you look at IBM's revenues from patent royalties and Linux-related services from 2001 to 2003. I just don't have the newer data with me. So this is the largest US patent holder and patent royalties, and this is Linux-related services going up to $2 billion a year in the past couple of years. That's exactly their model, right? Stuff will flow out of connected human beings. We call it an operating system, and we will build services on top of it and make a lot of money. That's a real challenge to understanding the role of social production in the new way in which the economy is adjusting to society. So social production is a real fact, not a fad. And by social production, I mean both peer production that's collaborative and commons-based production that's individual and distributed but nonetheless effective. So real fact, not a fad. It's the critical long-term shift that's caused by the internet. In some contexts, it's more efficient than markets and firms, not always. It is clearly sustainable and growing fast. It presents a threat to and is threatened by some of the incumbent business models, which is where you see so many of the battles coming in intellectual property and telecoms and a variety of other new funky laws that are trying to just say, don't change my world too much. I like my rents just fine as they are, thank you. Okay, so politics. And what I want to talk about, and this is a little quirky for the book, but not quirky for me. I've been doing this for a while. For all of the fact that it's got this quirky slant and critical slant, it's a very liberal book in terms of its politics. Not liberal in the sense of the current Democrats are liberals, but liberal in the sense of not critical theory type. So I want to talk about three things primarily with regard to autonomy. With regard to freedom and justice. Autonomy, democracy is what I'll spend most of my time on, and to some extent justice and development. And each of these occupies at least a chapter or more in the book, and I'm obviously happy to talk about them more later. So the critical thing about autonomy is the shift from consumers to users. Right? The shift in the cultural practice, both in the practical efficacy of being able to make things that are your own, alone and together with others, and in the cultural practice of desiring to do things that are creative, not only consumptive. And in turn, the creation of platforms and moves in communication that are themselves invitations for action in the simplest way. When you sell a game together with customization platforms and a whole culture of mods, that's treating the person there differently than when you're selling a finished good. So we have greater individual autonomy to do more for and by ourselves, both in what we can do by ourselves, but also in loose association with others. And looseness here is important, because there are many things we have to do with other people before the internet comes along. But usually those require a significant commitment, be they employment, be they neighborhood, be they family, be they long-term friendships. It's not as easy to create loose associations that are purpose-specific, that break up and come together and you exist in multiple of them. This allows the effective capacity of human cooperation to be loosened from tight, all-encompassing social relations. And so it allows more capacity through systems that don't necessarily require the same kind of autonomy. Now this creates the same kind of commitment. Now this creates a whole set of critiques with regard to whether it's fragmented society, which I'm happy to talk about, and I have a little chapter on in the book, but I'm not talking about it here because it's more of a response to a critique than it is central to my claim, but it may be interesting to people here. So for example, if you Google Viking ships, the first link, and it's been that way, top 1 or 2 or 3 for 5 years since I started to show this and talk about this particular site, is a wonderful place to go look with kids about Viking ships. It's produced by a 5th grade teacher in Gander, Newfoundland, who hosts it from his 5th grade class. One person. Now just imagine what it would mean for a teacher to put together teaching materials for his class in 5th grade for one class, let alone to become a major global center for education on this particular topic. This is a new capacity for individuals, things we could have dreamed of but not actually planned and done. There's also interconnection with the market. There's more autonomy vis-a-vis the structures of the market. So this was a story recently in the Times a couple of months ago about Madison, Wisconsin developing a for-owner buy-sale website that's getting around the multiple listing services, but has become essentially a place where if you want to buy a house there, you're more likely to find it here than through the real estate brokers. And not only things you can do by yourself, but things you can do together. So Michael Hart, for 20 years, tried to put together Project Gutenberg, used very small amounts, a public archive of everything. Now on the web, he's able to collaborate with many, many people and pull them together. So again, part of what is possible for the individual is what is possible for the individual together with others. Now let me talk about democracy. One of the funny things is that except for the early Dutch Republic, the early American Republic, 3 years of the French Republic and Britain and England for some period, we don't really have experience with democracy without mass media. The major move towards expansion of democracy, first against monarchies, then against fascist and communist enemies and counterparts, occurs in the context of mass media. Mass media used both by dictatorships and by democracy. So the one thing that we don't have is very good experience with what happens with a public sphere that's not mass mediated as a practical matter. And I think we'll begin to learn what it means. So what might one want from a democratic public sphere in functional terms? Because that allows us to map what's happening in the mass media environment as compared to the networked environment. You want universal intake in principle. If in principle everyone's concerns are appropriate for public action, then each person's concerns should, again, in principle, be observable at least by the public sphere. You want filtering, because if all you can hear everyone, the critical political choice is, as of everyone's pain, which is the one that we need to talk about. For relevance, what's relevant to politics and what's not relevant to politics, this is itself, of course, a contested category, right? Because my husband is beating me used to be not politically relevant, it was domestic. The question of relevance was major political question, and now it is politically relevant in most places. Actually, probably not in most places, in some places that we occupy. And also political credibility, right? Not everything that is relevant in principle, in its structure, is credible, right? The president is selling security policy to Middle Eastern interests. That's politically credible, even if untrue. The president is selling port security to Martians, has the same relevance structure, but a different level of credibility. So how do we create credibility? Synthesis and salience. How do we take all of these various things and turn them into something that we can, that enough people in society consider as a political item for action? That's something that the media needs to do in order to make it. And how is it independent from government? Now, the failings of mass media, many more people have written than I. I'm not going to do much. But let's just talk in terms of these particular components. First of all, a tiny intake funnel, right? Again, if you have only a very small number of means of communication, however dedicated and professional the journalists are, there are 30,000 of them. Maybe there are 100,000 of them. Then there are 300 million of the rest of us. Tiny intake funnel, which in the best of cases is at least elitist, in the sense of a cultural professional elite. And in the worst of cases is manipulated by dictatorships or manipulated by people who own media or disconnected from what the means. Now, the two classic arguments, obviously, that people make, and here I'll go through it quickly because obviously here everybody knows this by heart, is one is the control of owners, the disproportionate power to do filtering and synthesis. Your pain doesn't count, your pain does, and that's because of what I care about. So one might think of this as the Berlusconi effect, or the Baywatch effect, which is owners responding to the norm, producing bland, inoffensive, politically inoffensive fan. So what's the story of what the potential other is? There are no coffins in the mass media before the elections in 2004 in the US, and then Russ Kick, one person, sits on his Freedom of Information Act request for a few months, and then he gets the photos, and then he puts them up, and the next day they're all over the media. Now, he can afford to do it because he's got other things to do in life. He's like the people who are doing a couple of hours a week worth of free software or Wikipedia or whatever it is, except not even collaboratively, just on the side. That's a completely new source of filtering and getting around filters and deciding what's relevant. But let's talk about something that puts the power of distributed democratic, how are we doing here? Of distributed democratic action and speech against mass media. So 3 weeks roughly before the last election, Sinclair Broadcasting, which owns stations reaching about a quarter of American households, was described by the LA Times as planning to air a piece called Stolen Honor, which was supposedly a documentary, effectively a Swift Vote veterans, an hour-long Swift Vote veterans in the guise of a documentary. If you want to later, I can show you a little snippet of it. You'll see what I mean. So the LA Times reports it. Within a couple of days, the Kerry campaign, the DNC, shout and scream, and they go the way that big people go to the FEC and the FCC, and they write outrage letters, and nothing. But at the same time, something very different is happening. So Josh Marshall on Talking Points memo, and Daily Koss and Mike Dee start picking it up in the first few hours on Saturday morning. And they start talking. And other people start talking. And what do they do in this talking? They don't just kill us. They say, what can we do? Let's picket them. No, let's write to the FCC. No, let's tell them that next 3 years from now, when they come up for renewal, we're going to go and tell the FCC not to renew. Let's boycott them. Let's do this. Within the first 36 hours, a couple of websites emerged. One called Stop Sinclair and the other Boycott SPG. And around Tuesday, if the report was Saturday morning, around Tuesday morning, Josh Marshall starts really pointing a lot at this, at Boycott SPG, which was just created that Sunday. And then people start strategizing. Well, what should we do? Let's call the advertisers. Somebody says, no, I worked in media for years. The only thing that works if you go to local advertisers. Oh, who knows what the local advertisers? Well, let's all sit down at 6 o'clock and see who's advertising, and then we'll know. No, I found the list over here. I've created a list over here. Here's the list of 800 advertisers for these stations. Find where you are. Here, I've done a little utility so you can send an email to all of them. I just picked up the phone, and this is what I heard. Oh my goodness, somebody is now threatening us a day and a half later with canned spam act, as though this is spam. No, here I've got this post from a lawyer who says it's not spam because it's political, it's not commercial. But here's another picture of the same thing. It's plotted on Sinclair's stock price over the relevant 10 days or so. So what happens is the Times report happens up there. Then you've got the conversations over here. The Democratic establishment is moving around here. And then this is roughly where the boycott takes shape. And around here, there's a couple of media reports about this happening. About 80 advertisers actually begin to pull advertisements. And Lillian issues a warning that they're a little uncomfortable with advertising and maybe regulatory risk and this and that. And so this is Monday morning. This is Monday close. This is Tuesday midday when SPG says, documentary? What documentary? Wait, no. Just little clips in the beginning of a conversation about these things. This is Wednesday, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is the day after the election, and this is after that. So, is this the end of mass media power? No. But what it is it's an interesting case study on the ability to decide what matters, to filter what's relevant, to accredit it as a credible source and to figure out what are different credible forms of action, to raise it to a level of salience that it becomes a real point of political action, independent from the government, and in this case, independent and in opposition to a mass media outlets controlling a quarter of the TV screens in the country, including in most of the swing states. Another story. What do we do? Where does investigative reporting come from, and where does robustness to regulation come from? So here's the great moment of American journalism, right? A great moment of First Amendment in journalism. What do we have? The Times, Ellsberg goes, because of the credibility, they're able to spend the money to put reporters in a room for weeks to read through these things. They then have a platform. When they get an injunction, they can send it to their neighbors, and it can keep going until the injunction comes. But then, this is the great power of the independent media. They can hire a good lawyer, they can go to the Supreme Court, and they can get the injunction shoved back, and the public gets what they want. This is the way it's supposed to work, in the way that the fourth estate is supposed to work in conjunction with a strong independent judiciary. What's going to happen? Right? So there's Neil Netanel across the street at UCLA. One of his concerns is, where are we going to get this kind of investigative reporting? So let me tell you another story. Diebold is a company that makes voting machines. Makes quite a few voting machines, and it's based in Ohio. As you may remember, in 2000 there was 1 or 2 issues with the quality of voting systems in the United States. So in 2002, the first electronic voting machines were brought in. There was almost no coverage in the mass media. Here and there were a few stories in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, because Georgia was the first major place. Oh, people are worried about it, but we get assurances from so-and-so and so-and-so that it's fine. And so-and-so and so-and-so says that they're going to give us technical help. And of course, so-and-so is the official who bought it, and so-and-so and so-and-so is the official who sold it. But no real review. Now, you can understand this. They're hard systems. Right? The code is private. There's a lot of money behind it. It's very hard to find out. It's technically difficult. It's opaque to people. It's very hard. So what happened? Bev Harris, an activist, found the source code on an FTP site. Now, what did she do? Put it on blackboxvoting.org, her own site, but also put something on Scoop in New Zealand. And this is another context of what happens when you get into a global network where it's very hard to control, which put on the materials, an editorial, and a call to arms. Now, when you look at this, you actually see a few fascinating things that are critically different about the network public sphere than they are in the mass media. So we reveal for the first time the location complete online copy. What do we usually have in traditional mass media before online? Trust me, here's my digest. What do we have online? Here, see for yourself. Now, what do we do when we can't afford Floyd Abrams to go to the Supreme Court? Here, make more copies, so it won't be able to be suppressed. So here's where the files are. We know they're going to come after us. Make more copies all over the web. Now, some of these things are actually password protected, but here are these nice folks at lostpassword.com, and they can help you get around that problem. And some of these will get corrupted in the process. So here are these other nice people at ziprepair.com, and they'll let you for free get past those problems. And then, you know what? I don't have millions of dollars to pay reporters to sit and go through this for weeks, but it's really important. Good hunting. Tell us what you find. Post it here. And of course, one of the people who do this turns out to have the credibility of being a major security expert in Johns Hopkins. And this security group publishes a response. There's media exposure. Diebold has to respond. There's then peer review, which isn't portrayed here, to refine the problems. Maryland, one of the states that bought from Diebold, gets more reports, and eventually they require some changes. Well, that puts Bev Harris in the position of suddenly being somebody worth sending to. So 2-3 months later, an anonymous whistleblower finds a cache of internal emails from Diebold, again about their systems. And he does 2 things. He sends to Wired magazine. In this case, what can you do? Wired is traditional media. And to Bev Harris. Wired writes a story that goes, can you believe these bumbling fools? They lost their emails again. First they lose the source code, now they lose their emails. What sort of security do you have there? And that's the end of the story. Bev Harris, she knows what to do. She puts it on Black Box Voting. It goes to all these emails, except that now Diebold says, no, these emails, they're ours. This is copyright. We have the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. They don't send it to her. They send it to her ISP and say, you're hosting copyright infringement. Take them off. You have to. It's ours, and you can't have it. So he does, and that's the end of the story, except it isn't, because then there are some Swarthmore students who've already made copies, because they read in Scoop that you have to make copies. But Diebold already knows what to do, so they send Swarthmore the same. Swarthmore, university, you're the ISP. Under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, you have to keep them off. And that's the end of the story. The students don't get their emails. Right? Wrong. Because the students have already replicated in what it turns out to be a fascinating ecology of the legal and the illegal, of the commercial and the non-commercial, creating a very robust ecology that makes it very difficult to suppress anything. So individual users at other campuses make copies. The emails are then injected into Freenet, which is free software developed for censorship-resistant systems, not optimized for music, optimized for secret polices, or rather getting around them. but also into Overnet, which is a commercial peer-to-peer platform driven by people who want to share things rather than pay for them, even if it's illegal, but also that has free software clients to run over it. So again, commercial and non-commercial, legal and illegal, collaborate to create an ecology that makes it very difficult to suppress. Where is the law in all of this? Well, the students got support from the Electronic Frontier Foundation to go and bring a declaratory judgment in the US District Court saying we can use this is fair use, and in fact they win. They win to the point that even when Diebold says, no, we're sorry, we didn't mean to, we're never going to do it, the court says, no, you pay expenses because this was outrageous. But this happens a whole year later, after it would have been much too late to touch the elections. Instead, what happened is the emails were introduced somehow into the California State Commission procedure, which ended up decertifying a whole chunk of the Diebold machines, not everything, but a whole chunk of the machines, when it turned out that the machines actually implemented were different from the ones that were actually tested and certified. So, now we all know this story, the internet democratizes, right? We've been around this story for over a decade. We know everyone a pamphleteer. We've all read the hype of the mid-90s. So why am I selling this particular warmed over public sphere? First of all, because we've got much better stories, and we can go into the detail of why it works. But let me just say a few words about the critique and why I'm still moderately optimistic in a way that I think is more grounded than we had grounds to do a decade ago. So the first generation objections were essentially three: the Babel objection, the polarization objection, and the where will investigative reporting come from. So fragmentation, Cass Sunstein is the one who made this most clearly. He basically bought Nicholas Negroponte's idea of the Daily Me, which turned out not to be the way things worked out. And he said, look, if all of us read our own personal paper, there'll be no common public sphere, there's no common conversation. It turns out that the culture of web speech is completely different. It's not a little robot goes out and gets only what it is interesting to me. We see a culture of mutual linking. We see a culture of see for yourself. We see a culture of aggregation with lots of search capabilities, be they technorati for the blogosphere, be they move on in terms of actually organizing events. And we also see power law distribution of links, which I'll talk about in a minute, and I take it you know a good chunk about. There was also the claim of polarization, right? All these extreme groups. Now, Jack Balkin made a very important point about this. That Nazis are Nazis and can find each other more easily is not polarization of public discourse. It presents a new problem of policing, but it's not a polarization of the way people talk. Polarization of the way people talk is when people who are roughly within the mainstream at one point begin to drift apart and can't talk to each other. That isn't necessarily the case, and in fact, what we see in linking is the opposite. The fact that you have a culture of linking to the other's argument, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to link into the argument you dislike. And in fact, we have at least one study, Adamic and Glantz, that suggests that one of every 6 or 7 links at the top level of the political blogosphere link across the divide. Now, when they write about it, they say, my goodness, polarization is right. 85% of the links aren't talking to each other. They're only talking within the Republican or within the Democrat blogosphere. And I read that and I see a completely different interpretation. When you talk among friends, yeah, you bounce an idea, you don't bounce an idea. If you just think of the Sinclair, how many of the links were what should we do? At some point it reached a level of salience that it was important for the other side to see. 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 links across the divide, that counts as quite significant if your concern is you're just going to talk to yourself and get extreme views. Finally, with regard to who will be the watchdog, I think I tried to give you an example of what peer production of a watchdog function looks like. The second generation critique was essentially the opposite of the first one. It says, what we're actually seeing when we're looking at links on the net is a power law. A tiny number of sites get millions of links, and millions of links are seen by, and millions of sites are linked to by no one, and presumably therefore seen by no one. And so essentially what democracy? You can talk, but no one will hear you. That's the structure of the second. So this is roughly the shape, right? If this is a normal distribution, this is a power law distribution, tiny number, huge number with tiny number, tiny number with huge number of links, etc. I don't need to repeat this. So this is really a fairly new theoretical set of contributions, in many senses from 99. There's a fact about this, right? In principle, it shouldn't be that on Monday, that on Sunday, I'm sorry, not in principle. Based on this model, if it's just a question of whoever's been linked to will be linked to, or whoever's got an intrinsic growth curve that's different is growing differently, how can it be that on a Sunday you'll have a website launched, svg.org, and by Friday it will have had 300,000 unique visitors? And at the same time, another one would be launched on Monday, Stop Sinclair, and would have 150,000 signatures at the end of that week. That probabilistically can't happen. And yet intuitively it's obvious. Right? These people care about, the election, they care about democracy, they link to each other, they read. We all know intuitively why it happens. So the question is, what's the relationship between this theory and the real robust empirical findings about the linking, the impossibility of boycott SVG? And the truth is that when you actually look closer at the literature on network topology, which is mostly in computer science and physics now, you see two or three findings that help explain a lot, I think. The first is clustering. Again, intuitively easy, but also measured and theoretically there. Content-related sites cluster. That is to say, they interlink much more densely than things that are not related. Not surprising, political blogs link to political blogs more than they link to dogs, to sites about dogs. So much so that political blogosphere is more interlinked, the Democratic Republican, than either of them is to the outside. Politics breeds politics. Again, not surprising, but empirically and theoretically robust. And you see the emergence of a giant strongly connected core, which means to say about 30% of sites heavily interlink with each other. About 25% of sites can link only into this core, and another 25 can only be linked to. So these are basically documents or things like that, that there's no way out of them. And then another 10–15% are not really connected to the core. Now, again, Albert Barabashi, who is the main person in this round of network topology, looks at this and says, what democracy? Half the places can't be seen from anywhere. And I say, what democracy? Half the places can be seen from everywhere. Now, it's not just a question of optimism versus pessimism. This isn't only the glass. It's a question of what's your baseline. If your baseline is mass media, half the people actually get to be seen by everyone and for everyone? Wouldn't we all buy that by comparison to the mass media baseline? So the question is not, how does the net today compare to our utopian ideology of the early 90s about the Republic of Yeoman Clickers? The question is how it relates to the actuality of 150 years of gradual growth in democracy in the context of mass media. The other thing that we find is that when the clusters get small enough, the body becomes moderate. That is to say, the long term turns out to be a little fat. And we've got a number of studies about universities, about narrow topic clusters, and the most relevant, the most recent one, Dresner and Farrell, among political blogs when you get to smaller interest areas, not just Democrat, Republican in general, but specific areas. What's the difference? The difference is this. Instead of looking like a power law distribution like this, you have some moderate number of sites that have a moderate number of links, and then a tiny number of sites that still have a long tail. So there's one or two sites that really will have lots of links, but instead of having everyone have almost no links, you have some dozens or even low hundreds of sites that have some dozens of links to them. This is very different from a context where no one is linked to anyone, because this means that there are dozens or hundreds of entry points. And if the second generation concern is that the long tail with the lots of links becomes like the broadcast transmitter, everyone listens to this, instead it becomes like the broadcast antenna. The things that are cleared within the group of hundreds or even low thousands of sites that cluster in a way that they're visible still have one or two sites that are sufficiently visible outside the small cluster that they can transfer to higher regions, and what you get is an attention backbone with transmission, with a real place. So again, if we're looking at where does universal intake come from in the network public sphere, if you remember that was the concern, it comes from the fact that it's not the case that there are millions of places that are only one other place to link to or nobody else. But rather that in small interest, when I'm intensely interested in one place, there will be dozens or hundreds of smaller scale sites, each of which is nonetheless visible to those other hundreds with a mechanism for transmission. So suddenly now we have an actual mechanism for moving from being exactly like a soapbox, just to say anybody can get on top of it and no one will listen to them, to being something quite more substantial than that. So no, not everyone a pamphleteer, but we're also not intellectual lemmings. The structured web offers more visibility to more people in accreditation and filtration clusters, free of the financing constraints on speech. This is the translation moment from the change in economics. Relatively incorruptible because there is no core to buy. There are redundant hubs that provide alternative paths. And visibility, and this is another critical point, depends on what's intensely interesting to a small group of people who talk about it, instead of what's moderately acceptable to very large numbers of people. That's what gains salience, and that's very new. We also see strong linking practices in the major sites, many hubs that are themselves cooperative, like Slashdot and Delicon, strong see-for-yourself ethic and peer review, easier for each individual and small group to speak and be heard, easier to form purposive association, global, not local. Now, here you've done a lot more work on this, so I'll just pass on this very quickly. What we see is also the development. Up till now, I talked about the political public sphere. But politics is not where all of our sense of what relationship of people to culture. So, again, if we just look at Barbie, remember what we were talking about. This is the cultural image, as opposed to going in and talking specifically, what is it that we want to write about this? The way you produce the formalized statement about the cultural object is very different. And this is obviously just a very thin version of what I think is deeper, which has to go to the question of actually becoming a maker of culture as well, not only in low production values, as we always did when we sang songs this way or the other, but also in high production video and audio culture. Finally, I want to say a few words on development and its relationship to information. If we look at the Human Development Index, and this is all I want to say about justice. If we look at the Human Development Index, what's it made of? Health and life expectancy, educational literacy, and GDP per capita or growth. Each of these is intensely dependent on information in the global information economy. Right? Food security goes into research, and medicines goes into research. Research in journals, outcomes data that allows us to understand what the practices are goes into health and life expectancy. Books, teaching materials, computation, communication, libraries, academic centers, as they're affected by journals, goes to education and literacy. And that innovation is the primary driver of growth is not news to anyone. So, what it means is that while information and expression are intrinsic to democracy and autonomy, they are very closely instrumentally tied to the determinants of human development in a global information economy. And so the question then becomes, given that more of what makes for human welfare and development depends on information, knowledge, and culture, what we're beginning to see is social production and peer production being applied to help and alleviate. And here I have to be more cautious in what I say, right? This is not going to solve dirty water in Africa. But the question is, is the level of suffering enough that if we reduce it some, the game is still worth the candle? And I think the answer is yes. So we're beginning to see it early now more than anywhere else in free and open source software. Brazil has a very strong program on moving to free and open source software, both as a mechanism of getting telecenters that are relatively inexpensive. I mean, we know that once we actually see the $100 computer, it's supposed to be a Linux box. But more importantly, in the Brazilian context, this is a context in which you don't need capital in order to compete in software services. Because there's a major global market for software services on free software, and by adopting it, they're hoping to create an internal market that will sustain people who are really good at it and be able to be an introduction. Open academic publishing. We're beginning to see something like an open source, or at least moves for an open source agriculture innovation in BIOS. Bioinformatics and the HapMap project, we're seeing people in the information side of biotechnology moving very heavily towards an open source model, maybe biomedical innovation. So just to give a little image. If the traditional model of scientific publication was very much within the big money arrangement, right? Funding from the NIH went to universities, promotion and tenure depended on publication. Publication was necessary for funding and for promotion and tenure. You had a closed system with about a 700% increase in cost in the past 15 to 20 years. Now what do we have? We have resistance by the academics, and we're beginning to have individuals put up working papers, web-based self-archiving. We're having market actors who are not themselves based on intellectual property, but instead on free distribution of the materials, but charging author payments, which means the author payments then get put into their funding. The NIH just said now you have to publish everything in something that will be available at least 12 months later freely, so suddenly there's room for the NIH to be funding market-based players who are not IP-based, as well as nonprofit like the Public Library of Science, ArcSIV, the Budapest Open Access Initiative, Michigan Oyster Project. We're beginning to see an ecology of government, non-government, traditional NGO, individuals, universities, and non-IP based businesses creating an ecology of publication that doesn't require appropriation. And this follows, of course, the way that the software industry works, where software, the critical enabling characteristic here is that software services is twice as large as software publishing. So all those people who know how to code have annual revenues available to pay their lives. They're about 3 times the size of all of Hollywood. That's without software publishing. So this is easy in a sense, but that's the same structure. Non-IP based market, NGOs, individuals, universities, and government funding. And that's largely a potential model for integrating these platforms to achieve non-proprietary, widely available, cheap access to information necessary for individuals. So this is BIOS, this is open source, biological innovation for an open society, at agriculture, open source agriculture. This is a really quirky idea. This is Will Scott at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis, who's putting together kits that after he gets targets from distributed computing projects to synthesize, he puts together kits and sends them out to undergraduate chemistry classes who are going to do stuff anyway and then throw it in the garbage. And instead, they're synthesizing the stuff that are the targets that are identified as potentially interesting targets. So these are very early versions of trying to do the much harder job of doing peer production when you are in the physical world. So, as it turns out, though, the incumbents of the industrial information economy are not going quietly. We're in the midst of a series of legal battles basically intended to stabilize the condition. Just don't make waves. It's carried out at all layers of the communication system. In infrastructure, in telecoms, in infrastructure, in devices like things like the Induce Act and Serendipity, the efforts to design the chip, in software and software patents and standards, in contact with intellectual property. But, and this is the critical system, and I was telling Mimi earlier, I spent most of the last 10 years thinking that this could really work and shut everything down. And as I've been working more, I'm a little more optimistic that there's a lot of deep cultural, social, economic forces that I talked about today that are not that easy to legislate away. So I don't want to find myself in the condition of John Perry Barlow 12 years ago saying, go away all of you, you're all dead, you just don't know it. But there are strong forces arrayed against the industrial information economy. So in broadband policy, we see the duopoly that's very loosely regulated, but pushed back on by open wireless plus municipal broadband, maybe. I know, that's wishful thinking. We see the focus on trying to create trusted systems, regulation of device design. But on the other hand, we see the huge market pull for general purpose devices. And that's really what's being pushing back both in the political economy and in the market. Software and standards, we see software patents being pushed on one side, but we see free and open source software. We see development of an awareness that non-IP-based business models are possible. We see very strong copyright protections like the DMCA, the No Electronic Theft Act, copyright liability for developing all sorts of utilities, database efforts, particularly in Europe, but efforts to pass here. But on the other hand, we see successful internet-based innovation and sharing practices creating the reality. With regard to information, copyright is expanded, broader, fair use is narrowed, more criminalized, no de minimis, all sorts of things. Click-wrap licenses are enforced, all sorts of new rights like trespass to chattels, international harmonization, database rights. When you line up everything, all the toggles go one way. But you see more sharing practices. You see things like the Creative Commons and the Public Library of Science where people are actually organizing to say a pox on your legal house, we'll just roll our own. We'll make our own commons without your law contractually. And we're beginning to see the growth of the access to knowledge movement when you see people from Médecins Sans Frontières sitting together with Cisco, sitting together with the Brazilian government, sitting together with a whole bunch of academics from all sorts of places, sitting together with people who are media advocates and other people. It's an interesting combination. And that's the combination we're seeing in the last couple of years, pushing back on the TRIPS, on the WTO IP regime, pushing back on WIPO. So we're at a moment of opportunity. If we think of social arrangements as having moments of stabilization and destabilization, we're in the middle of a technological perturbation that allows for greater individual human agency, expanding the domain of effective action for diverse motivations. As a practical matter, we see this greater autonomy translating into social share and exchange that is emerging as a major modality of economic production, creates new business challenges and opportunities, creates, more importantly, new ways of being free and equal human being, but is subject to a global and persistent political, regulatory, and social cultural battle. The stakes have to be understood not as technical, but in terms of political morality. And I think the time window is fairly small, because things gel after a while. Radio had a certain characteristic, and in about 7 or 8 years, the current system, from the first broadcast until what we have now, was stabilized. And I'd suggest to you that as economic policy, allowing the incumbents of the industrial information economy to create the conditions of competition tomorrow is a mistake. But as a matter of political morality, missing the opportunity to improve productivity and at the same time the conditions of autonomy, democracy, and social justice, that's unforgivable. Thank you.